Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Welcome to Planet America. Hello, I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, 2 mass shootings in 24 hours puts gun violence front and centre in the presidential campaign.
This has been going on for years and years in our country. We have to get it stopped.
The El Paso shooting has been classified as an act of domestic terrorism by a white supremacist. And Democrats, you'll be surprised to hear, are blaming Trump.
This president has fanned the flames of white supremacy in this nation.
Also this week, we'll look at the history of the Second Amendment. Is this what the Founding Fathers had in mind?
I'll be looking at the minimum wage as well as the state of the American economy.
And we'll ask a former presidential candidate when you know your White House dream is over.
But first, this.
Two deadly mass shootings within 24 hours have reignited the debate over gun control in America, this time overlaid with the spectre of racially motivated violence. In the first attack in the border city of El Paso, Texas, 22 people were shot and killed in a Walmart store just after 10:30 on Saturday morning local time. 24 others were wounded. The 21-year-old gunman drove 1,000 kilometres to the majority Latino city, having expressed a desire online to kill Mexicans and voicing support for President Trump. Former Texas Congressman and Democratic presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke was swift to lay the blame at the feet of Donald Trump.
The president's language, his rhetoric, has produced the kinds of hate crimes that we saw in El Paso yesterday, but we've been seeing across this country. They've been on the rise for each one of the last 3 years.
Acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney pushed back at that.
Look, there's no benefit here to trying to make this a political issue. This is a social issue, and we need to address it as that.
The gunman was armed with an AK-47 military-style assault rifle, which he bought legally and carried into the Walmart legally, as Texas law permits the open carry of firearms. Walmart also stocks guns and ammunition. The shooter was taken into custody. He is being treated as a terrorist and faces the death penalty, Chaz.
Yeah, these white supremacist shootings are becoming a bit of a thing, John. By July, the FBI had already made more than 100 domestic terrorism-related arrests this year, more than in the whole of 2018. And according to the FBI director, a majority of the FBI's domestic terrorism cases have involved white supremacist violence. But at least early on, the media was more Trump's focus, tweeting that the fake news contributed greatly to the anger and rage, and that if news coverage didn't get fairer, then these terrible problems would only get worse. Look, if you do want to blame someone other than the shooter himself, maybe turn your attention to 8chan, an internet message board where people post all kinds of dodgy stuff. The shooter frequented 8chan and posted his manifesto there, and this was the third white supremacist shooting for 2019 that the site encouraged and celebrated. But it was third time unlucky for 8chan. This time, their domain masking service, Cloudflare, dumped them. So they registered with 2cows, who then dumped them as well. So they then switched to Epic, who were then dumped by their provider, Voxility. This is going to continue for a while, John, but they'll be online soon enough. If Nazi site The Daily Stormer got back online, 8chan will. But in the meantime, be thankful for small mercies.
Well, the second shooting last weekend took place just after 1 a.m. on Sunday in a nightclub district of Dayton, Ohio. A 24-year-old man wearing body armour and a mask opened fire with a .223 caliber rifle with a high-capacity magazine capable of holding up to 250 bullets. In 30 seconds, he killed 9 people and wounded 27 others before being killed by police. He was stopped before he could enter a nightclub. Police say that hundreds could have died if he hadn't been stopped. His weapons were bought legally online from Texas, and police say there was nothing in his past to have stopped him from buying those weapons legally as well. US Senator from Ohio, Democrat Sherrod Brown, called on Congress to act.
The House of Representatives has passed a bill to do background checks, overwhelmingly bipartisanly. I've called on Senator McConnell to bring the Senate back into session. We can pass that in one afternoon, background checks. The President of the United States could sign it that day.
And in that spirit of bipartisanship, Ohio's Republican Senator Rob Portman added his voice to calls for more background checks and also said that the problem goes further than gun laws.
We have a crisis in this country. There's no question about it. You know, people have talked about the deaths of despair, and they talk about the suicide rates, they talk about the addiction rates, and they talk about the mental health issues that are causing some of these. So this is a broader discussion that needs to be had.
The key phrase that you said, John, is nothing in his past would have stopped him buying the weapon legally. Because let me tell you what was in his past. He was suspended after scrawling a kill list on a bathroom wall at school. He was suspended again after making a list of girls he wanted to rape. And one day, 300 students from his school stayed home because they feared he planned to shoot the school up. His ex-girlfriend said he heard voices and would cry to her that he was afraid he would hurt someone one day. Now that should all be probably enough to stop him buying a weapon. And that's the idea behind red flag laws. That is, if someone is a walking time bomb, you can petition a court to stop them from owning a gun. Last year in Vermont, red flag laws kept a potential school shooter from getting a gun. It turned out that he'd made detailed plans already for the shooting, hoping to kill more people than in any other school shooting. But no gun. There's evidence red flag laws can help, and Conservatives and Trump are open to them. So let's hope something happens, at least in that regard. It seems more promising than the Hannity solution.
I'd like to see the perimeter of every school in America surrounded, secured by retired police, which you are, retired Secret Service, which you are, military, have one armed guard on every floor of every school, all over every mall.
What could possibly go wrong?
What indeed? President Trump visited both Dayton and El Paso this week after having condemned racism and intolerance.
In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America.
That is scripted, Donald Trump, according to Democratic presidential frontrunner Joe Biden. It is Trump himself, though, that has encouraged all this hatred.
It's both clear language and in code. This president has fanned the flames of white supremacy in this nation. His low energy, vacant-eyed mouthing of the words written for him, condemning white supremacists this week, I don't believe fooled anyone.
Biden cited a recent rally in Florida where Trump, off script, laughed at a supporter who shouted out that immigrants should be shot.
But how do you stop these people? You can't. There's no... That's only in the panhandle you can get away with that statement.
Well, President Trump wasn't impressed with Biden's speech.
Watching Sleepy Joe Biden make a speech so boring, the lamestream media will die in the ratings and clicks with this guy. It will be over for them, not to mention the fact that our country will be doing poorly with him. It will be one big crash, but at least China will be happy.
Speaking on the presidential campaign trail in Iowa this week, Senator Elizabeth Warren outlined her strategy for passing new gun laws.
When I am president, I like saying that. When I am president, we're going to get rid of the filibuster and we're going to pass some serious gun legislation in this country.
Fellow Democratic presidential hopeful Mayor Pete Buttigieg was also asked on Fox News if he thinks it's fair for Trump to be blamed.
Well, there's no question that white nationalism is condoned at the highest levels of our government.
This week, the president did tweet that he supports background checks, but then he linked the issue to immigration reform.
Republicans and Democrats must come together and get strong background checks, perhaps marrying this legislation with desperately needed immigration reform. We must have something good, if not great, come out of these two tragic events.
Well, on that, Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan, yet another Democrat running for president, described Trump's connection of the two issues this way.
That's an absolute freaking joke. that he's going to tie this to the most polarizing issue happening in the United States today around immigration reform.
Well, as for coming together to do anything, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has so far refused to recall the Senate from a 6-week recess. Democratic leadership want the Senate to pass a House bill that's already passed, expanding background checks. McConnell is at home recovering after breaking his shoulder in a fall in Louisville, Kentucky. Tim Ryan, by the way, is driving to McConnell's house to try and convince him to get the Senate back together and do something pronto.
The big question is, which Democrat has been the most opportunistic? I'd say it's a tight contest between Tim Ryan literally leading a caravan to Mitch McConnell's house and Beto O'Rourke spending the entire week cussing and comparing Trump's rhetoric to Hitler.
The only modern Western democracy that I can think of that said anything close to this is the Third Reich, Nazi Germany.
It's hard to say, John, but it's only been 5 days, so give him some time.
Well, speaking of the presidential campaign, let's check in with how the polls are looking. President Trump registered 42% approval in the Gallup poll this week, down 2 points from the same Gallup poll a month ago. Other polls range from 40% in the Reuters Ipsos poll to 49% in the presidentially preferred Rasmussen poll, averaging out at 43% approval this week. And remember, Trump won in 2016 with just 46% of the vote. As for the Democrats campaigning to take on the president next November, Biden is steady on 32% support. His lead is close to 15 points over Sanders, who is the biggest winner since the debates of last week. He's up 2. Then comes Warren, up a little on 15%. Harris seems to have lost those 2 points to Bernie. She's now at around 9%, followed by Mayor Pete, Beto, Booker, Yang and Castro, the only candidates above 1% this week. But within that average, there's something going on with Elizabeth Warren. According to a Harvard-Harris poll this week, she's on just 8% support in 4th place behind Harris, while in a Quinnipiac poll this week, she's on 21 points, to be second only to Biden, 7 points clear of Bernie Sanders. The difference can possibly be explained by the fact that the Harvard-Harris poll was of registered voters, while Quinnipiac only spoke to Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents. That Quinnipiac poll also has some good news for Warren in the crosstabs. They polled Democrats who watched most or all of the debates. 81% said, yeah, I watched it. 8.7 million Americans, in fact, watched the first debate. 10.7 watched the second. And pollsters asked who did the best job. Warren was the clear winner, almost double the score of Joe Biden. They also asked who has the best policies, and again, a big win for Elizabeth Warren, almost double Joe Biden. But here comes the bummer. Who has the best chance of beating Trump? It's Biden on 49%, then daylight, some more daylight, a bit more daylight, and then Sanders and Warren on just 9%. And that right there is her biggest problem right now, Chaz, trying to win this electability argument. But at least she has one less rival to concern herself with. Let's dust off the old guess who's not going to be president game.
Guess who won't be president?
Former Senator Mike Gravel announced this week that he is ending his presidential campaign. There goes Grandpa Mike. The 89-year-old also had some good news for a whippersnapper 11 years his junior.
I'm proud and honored to endorse Senator Bernie Sanders for the presidency of the United States.
Well, Gravel's had enough of being ignored, but there might still be some new candidates who can be ignored,
Really?
John. Yes, Michael Avenatti is apparently still considering a run. Avenatti says there's a 50-50 chance of entering the race in a few months. It might depend on if he's in jail or not, although Avenatti did hold a presser last month.
Anything else? Great, thank you.
And it was clear that even though he's fallen on hard times, Avenatti is still the same draw card he always was, attracting a massive crowd to his press conference there. You see, John, that there says presidential candidate to me, as long as the candidate is John Delaney.
I'm sure there are thousands in the back row there. They're just out of shot. We can't see them. There's a throng.
No doubt. Another newcomer to the race is billionaire Tom Steyer. He's been busy trying to buy donations and support in Iowa and New Hampshire. And if the latest Morning Consult poll is correct, it's paying off. This is a poll of early primary states, and Steyer has jumped in at 6%. looking like he could become a real player by the next debate, assuming he qualifies. So far, there are 9 qualifiers for the September debate, the usual 5, plus Cory Booker, Beto O'Rourke, Amy Klobuchar and Andrew Yang. Right on the verge of qualifying, needing just one more good poll, is Julian Castro, and the only other candidates with a realistic shot are Steyer, Hickenlooper, Gillibrand and Tulsi Gabbard. Sorry, Marianne Williamson fans.
They're both heartbroken, I'm sure. Well, the heart of the debate over gun control in the United States is, of course, the Second Amendment to the US Constitution, which asserts the right to bear arms. But debate continues about what it really means and whether a nation with more firearms than people is what the founders had in mind. The founding fathers of the United States, guys like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, were pretty happy with the Constitution they came up with in the 1770s. But the states wanted more, a Bill of Rights to protect them from a new federal government that could maybe return to monarchy or turn into a dictatorship. In the end, they settled on an initial 10 amendments to the Constitution, covering everything from freedom of religion and speech to the press, assembly, the right to be tried by a jury, and a bunch of states' rights. There are a lot of safeguards in there, but the one that we're concerned about is the Second Amendment, which says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. 27 words, 3 commas and a full stop. That in part explains why, 228 years after ratification, America is awash with 400 million guns, some of which were used in hundreds of mass shootings and tens of thousands of murders and suicides each year. Turns out that's not exactly what James Madison had in mind when he proposed the Second Amendment. He was trying to give more powers to state militias, the forerunner of today's National Guard. And it was a compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, who wanted the states to remain the dominant force in the new republic. At the time, the late 18th century, a majority of men owned a gun. It's hard to be exact, but 54% of male estates itemised in 1774 included a gun. Oh, and 14% had a sword. It wasn't until a century or so later that the Supreme Court started trying to figure out exactly what that Second Amendment really meant. Could there be laws restricting individuals from getting arms, or did it really mean that anyone could have as many guns or swords as they liked? In 1876, in a ruling on US v Cruikshank, Chief Justice Morrison Waite wrote, "The US federal government's authority is defined and limited by the Constitution. All other powers are reserved to the states or the people." So, while the Second Amendment stopped the federal government from infringing people's rights under the Constitution, it did not prevent the states from doing so. Music to the ears of Southerners, including members of the Ku Klux Klan, who really rather wanted to deny a lot of rights, including gun rights, to former slaves. There was another important case in the evolution of America's gun laws. The Depression era of the 1930s was also awash with guns and crime. In 1939, 2 men were arrested for taking a sawn-off shotgun across state lines in breach of a new Federal Firearms Act. They took it to the Supreme Court, which found, in the absence of any evidence tending to show the shotgun had some reasonable relationship to a well-regulated militia, they were not protected by the Second Amendment. That was a particularly helpful ruling, otherwise we might have 400 million rocket launchers and privately owned tanks in America too. The National Rifle Association, which is mostly funded by gun makers, has long argued the Second Amendment is essential for freedom, as it defends all other rights as well.
It alone offers the absolute capacity to live without fear.
In that formulation, many Americans believe they aren't just fighting to hold on to their guns, but all of their freedoms. Which is why Chuck Heston used to also say things like,
"From my cold, dead hands."
Debate continues to this day about whether Second Amendment rights are individual or collective, and the extent to which the federal government can impose national standards like a assault weapons ban. Meanwhile, the states are going their own way, and gun laws don't just reflect the partisan divide, but they also reinforce it. Republicans are more than twice as likely to own a gun and think owning it is essential to their freedom. The bottom line, 44% of Americans personally know somebody who's been shot. Close to 13,000 Americans are murdered with a gun each year. 22,000 kill themselves with a gun, and over 100,000 are injured by guns. But the real bottom line is this. Last year, America's gun stores made a profit of $11 billion.
Congratulations, Congress! You've broken a record! Yes, it's the record for the longest period without a minimum wage increase! Yes, the minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour, as it's been for more than a decade. These days it covers about 1.7 million workers, and over half of them are over 25 years old, so it doesn't just affect kids at McDonald's. If we account for inflation, it's dropped about $1.20 in value since it was last raised. It's actually $4.25 lower in value than it was in 1968. That's why in 2015, Bernie Sanders introduced a proposal for a $15 minimum wage. And 4 years later, the House passed a bill that would do just that by 2024. That's a raise approved by 67% of Americans, according to Pew. And yes, pushing the raise off to 2024 reduces its purchasing power by about $1.50, and also the Senate will never pass it. That's why most of America isn't waiting. 29 states have already legislated a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum. 7 of those states have already legislated for a minimum of $15 an hour. So while back in 1998, most minimum wage workers were on the federal minimum wage, these days many more minimum wage workers are on the state minimum wages or local minimum wages. In fact, the effective average minimum wage in 2019 is estimated to be around $11.80 an hour. Now you don't hear that often. In fact, only 0.23% of male workers and 0.37% of female workers are currently on the federal minimum wage. So does that mean there's no point lifting the federal minimum wage then? No, because according to the Congressional Budget Office, raising the federal minimum wage lifts many more boats. The CBO said that $15 an hour by 2025 would raise the pay of 27 million workers. That's 17% of the workforce. It would raise the incomes of those under the poverty line by 5.3%, and it would reduce the numbers of people in poverty by 1.3 million. So what's the downside? A $15 minimum wage would raise prices by $39 billion, or 0.3%. It would reduce the incomes of those above the poverty line by 0.1%. So it would effectively take $30 billion from the middle and upper classes in order to give $21 billion to the poor. Also, the minimum wage is a one-size-fits-all solution, but different parts of the country have different costs of living. For instance, in all the green areas on this map, the cost of living is so low that $15 an hour is worth effectively more, potentially as much as $20 an hour in the dark green areas. So if you force a big minimum wage hike on them, that could lead to seriously negative repercussions. And this is where we get to the big issue: job losses. For years, economists have argued about the effect of minimum wage hikes on unemployment. Just this week, there have been a slew of articles about how in New York the $15 minimum wage has been a disaster. Apparently, 36% of restaurants said they've laid off employees, 77% said they'd slashed employee hours, and 90% said they had to increase prices. Mind you, those numbers came from a restaurant industry group who wanted to pay less, so bear that in mind. And these kinds of individual cases vary wildly anyway, and they change over time. Literally every year there is another study released about the Seattle minimum wage hikes, which contradicts a previous study. This is why you need to look at more than one case. How about 138 cases between 1979 and 2016? This meta-study found the overall number of low-wage jobs remained essentially unchanged over 5 years following the increase. But they did find evidence of lower employment levels in sectors exposed to international trade. Well, look, that's fine, but before 2016, the minimum wage hikes were quite small. Under the Democrats' proposal, some states could double their minimum wage. So what happens then? Well, another study just came out that analysed the effect of a few minimum wage hikes to $15 an hour in low-paying counties. And they did not detect adverse effects on employment, weekly hours, or annual weeks worked. Finally, there's also that CBO study I referred to earlier, which crunched all the research out there, and they found a 2/3 chance that the change in employment would lie between 0 and a reduction of 3.7 million workers, with a median estimate of 1.3 million fewer workers nationally, or a 0.8% drop in employment. By the way, a minimum wage hike could have other negative impacts. For instance, one study found robust evidence that minimum wage hikes decrease the chances of workers receiving employer-sponsored health insurance, particularly low-wage workers. So that shouldn't be forgotten. But the bottom line is, while there probably will be some jobs lost, we don't know for sure what might happen under a $15 minimum wage. And the research from the last few years is ringing significantly fewer alarm bells than once thought, especially given some of the other positives that researchers have dug up. Lower suicide rates, lower recidivism rates for crime, more productive workers, and more consumer spending. Needless to say, those last two items are very good for the economy, so that could reduce the numbers of jobs lost in the medium term. Besides, we all want what's best for the working poor.
These shoes shine enough for you, Governor?
Does that look like my reflection to you? Well, most of them.
There are around 24 candidates being taken relatively seriously in their campaigns to be the Democratic Party's presidential nominee. Among them, senators and former senators, governors and former governors, members of Congress and former members of Congress, plus a tech entrepreneur and a self-help author. For all but one of these candidates, there will come a time when they realise their dream of being their party's nominee for President of the United States is not going to happen, at least not in 2020. As a candidate, how do you make that call? Or is it made for you by the party or donors or the voters themselves? Bill Richardson ran for president in 2008 as a Democrat. His resume certainly looked like White House material. A 7-term congressman from New Mexico, he served in Bill Clinton's cabinet as ambassador to the United Nations, then 2 terms as governor of New Mexico. Washington experience, executive experience, foreign affairs experience. On top of that, he came from a Latino background and a swing state. But 2008 was an election that Democrats expected to win after almost 8 years of the increasingly unpopular Bush administration, and Richardson found himself running in a large field, including Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, former vice presidential nominee John Edwards, and future VP Joe Biden. Richardson got about 5% support in national polls, but in the summer of 2007, he was catching on in first to vote Iowa. With around 12% support, he was just 5 points behind the eventual winner, Barack Obama. From there, of course, history shows that Obama surged to win Iowa, the nomination and the presidency, while Bill Richardson did not. So let's find out what it's like to be a candidate for president and at what point you know you're going to have to end your campaign. Bill Richardson is with us from Washington, D.C. Governor, welcome back to Planet America.
Nice to be with you.
In 2008, you were in a fairly crowded presidential field and you managed to challenge that top tier of Obama, Clinton and Edwards in the early states. So what is your advice for candidates today?
I would say don't concentrate on the first 2 primaries alone, which is a mistake that I made, Iowa and New Hampshire. And then when I came out, as you said, 4th, although we were close, I ran out of money to keep going. I would say pick states where you think you have a chance. Don't put all your eggs in one basket at first, but find a moment before the first primary vote to shine, to distinguish yourself, to come up with a policy position on healthcare, on immigration. I think the biggest issues in America are going to be the economy. How can you put more money in people's pockets? How can you protect civil rights, especially with a president who is very clearly appealing to his very, very nationalistic base.
So are you suggesting the early states are now less important than they once were? Because history says if you don't finish in the top 2 in New Hampshire, for instance, you are not going to be the Democratic nominee.
Well, now that's changed for 2 reasons. One, California, which is our biggest state, has now moved up substantially. So you can wait until California, which will be in March, to make your move. That didn't happen before. And secondly, the importance of the African American vote, the black vote in South Carolina and Nevada. Those comes early. And candidates have to realize that 30% of the vote of the Democratic primary is African American. So you need to do well with African American voters, no matter where you're running. And in Iowa and New Hampshire, there are very few African American and Hispanic voters.
What are the considerations for a candidate deciding how long to stay in the race, particularly if, as maybe a dozen candidates are about to find out themselves, they're going to be excluded from debates from here on in?
Well, right now there are two criteria, and some candidates will not make it. Number one, fundraising. Do you have a certain number of donors? Even though you can get $1 for a donor, that qualifies as a donor. The second is you have to be about 2 or 3% in the polls. And that's going to eliminate quite a few candidates for the next debates. So that criteria did not exist when I was running, but exists today because there's so many candidates. There are 23. When I was running in 2008, I think there were seven or eight of us. So it was really the debates that allowed you to make decisions as a voter on the candidates, not fundraising and not the other criteria. But I will tell you, if you don't do well early on in the primaries, your money dries up from supporters, and then you can't continue, because what you don't want to do is incur personal debt to keep your campaign going unless you're a very wealthy person.
That's a fascinating crunch point. Once you've launched a campaign for president, you've aspired to that office with such huge responsibility. How hard is it to say, it is just not going to happen for me?
For me, after New Hampshire, after I came in fourth, and I did respectably, the next primary was Nevada, where we had a great organization. But then my family, my advisors said, to stay going in Nevada, we're going to need at least $1 million. And we can't raise it because your supporters think you're not going to make it. So I had to decide, do I put my money in? And my wife was very clear. She said, that's it. So I dropped out. I think these are the considerations that face candidates, unless you're a very wealthy candidate like Bloomberg or Trump that can use personal resources. You know, you have to face reality. I was lucky because I was still governor in New Mexico. So I went back to being governor, finished my term, and now things are good for me. You asked me to speak and give opinions. That's what I do now, because I'm not a player anymore. I just give opinions.
As a professional pundit these days, President Trump seems to have very solid support. He's escaped the worst-case scenario from the Mueller report. The economy is stronger than it's been in a decade. Is he the favourite to win re-election next year?
My view is the president will not be the favourite. I think he's going to have a tough time being re-elected because he just has appeal to his very narrow base, and it's not going to be enough. In America, there are 4 states that decide the presidential election: Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, all states that President Trump won. Today, he's far behind in those states, and I think we will have a candidate that will do well in those 4 states, beat him, because we know where the rest of the country, other states, how they're going to vote. I believe if we come out clean with these primaries, we get unified, we don't have so many candidates fighting each other, that we're going to be okay. But it's still very early. I can tell you that voters can change their minds. They're 6 months away from the first vote in Iowa and New Hampshire, the early primaries. So nothing is settled yet, but I don't think President Trump is going to be reelected. That's my view.
Bill Richardson, always good to have you with us. Thanks for your time again.
Thank you.
The ongoing trade war between the United States and China escalated further this week, leading to a rollercoaster ride on stock markets around the world. China responded to the latest round of US tariffs by devaluing their currency, yuan. That saw President Trump label them a currency manipulator and call on the Federal Reserve to listen to him.
China dropped the price of their currency to an almost historic low. It's called currency manipulation, a listening Federal Reserve. This is a major violation which will greatly weaken China over time.
Assuming they are listening, though, what does he actually expect the Fed to do about it? They're supposed to act independently from political pressure. Well, he hinted at a possible devaluation of the US dollar in return, but Bloomberg analysts suggest the president is just trying to goad the central bank into easing monetary policy and again cutting interest rates, Chaz.
Ironically, the reason the Chinese currency fell was because they stopped messing with it. But I wanted to focus on this week's employment survey because some patterns are starting to emerge and they may not be positive ones. There were 164,000 jobs created in July, keeping the unemployment rate at 3.7%, which is great. But jobs growth is definitely starting to slow. In Trump's first 31 months, there have been 6 million jobs created compared to almost 7 million jobs during Obama's final 31 months. And jobs are particularly drying up in his so-called goods-producing industries, mining, manufacturing and construction. They used to be a strength for this administration, but there have only been 160,000 jobs created in those industries this year, compared to 414,000 jobs created over the same period 12 months ago. Is that a trade war thing? I don't know, but it isn't good. To wages and hourly wages have been growing slowly but steadily for blue-collar workers, but look at this. Weekly hours worked for blue-collar workers have been dropping all year. So when you multiply those fewer hours by greater hourly wages, weekly wages for blue-collar workers are actually going slightly down, which may become another issue. Finally, there is one more very important number from this survey that I'd like to draw your attention to. To the wall!
Big, beautiful wall.
79.5%. That is the magic number. It's called the prime age employment to population ratio. In other words, 79.5% of 25 to 54-year-olds have a job. The reason we focus on 25 to 54s is to exclude students and early retirees. And I'll tell you why this number matters. For years, people have been speculating why wages aren't growing more as unemployment rates drop. In fact, if we look at the unemployment rate versus nominal wage growth for the last 25 years, you can see the results have been a bit all over the place. In fact, the red dots, they're from the last 3 years, and you can see their results have been well below the trend. Wage growth has been lower than expected. But what if rather than using the regular old unemployment rate, we use the prime age employment to population ratio, or in this case, the prime age non-employment to population ratio? Look at the spread now. It's much tighter. And results from the last 3 years fit the trend line perfectly. Now, of course, correlation does not equal causation, but maybe if the prime age employment to population ratio was to raise by, say, another point or two, then wage growth might be pretty good. But that's not the only thing that this number tells us. A few months back, I explained economists often use the prices of 3-month Treasury bonds and 10-year Treasury bonds to predict recessions. I showed you that when 10-year bond rates were lower than 3-month bond rates, they're the yellow areas here, a recession, the red zones, is usually not too much later. And you'll note, by the way, America is smack bang in the middle of another yellow area, suggesting a red zone recession might be coming soon. Fine. But if we look at the graph of our magic number, the prime age employment to population ratio over the last 60 years, you can see, well, firstly, you can see that there are more people employed as more women have joined the workforce. No surprise there. But that's not the important bit. Look at the mini peaks, one after another after another. Now, let's look at the recessions, which are the red zones, and you can see once again, right after a peak, there is almost always a recession. Correlation does not equal causation once again, but that is a very interesting pattern nevertheless. And if we zoom into the last few years of that graph, you will notice America has just experienced another peak. Hence the importance of 79.5%. That number is on the way down, which may mean a recession is coming. So keep your eye on that number there. The entire 2020 election may depend on it.
Before we go, at the end of what has been a very difficult week in the United States, we wanted to address one of the burning questions in all of this, Chaz. To what extent can we say the El Paso shooting in particular was the fault of Donald Trump? It is being recognised as an act of domestic terrorism, a hate crime by a white nationalist who supported and echoed the rhetoric of Donald Trump.
Look, that's true. It is true that, especially the language of invasion, which was prominent in his manifesto, we won't go into that too much, but Trump has used the word invasion a lot to describe illegal immigration. I believe he's booked 2,200 Facebook ads that revolve around the word invasion. So that's a very prominent part of his rhetoric. But having said that, I just don't think you can pin this one on Trump. Like, for a start, the language that these guys use, the theories that they use, Trump is very incoherent on. One day he's talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the next day he's talking about Baltimore. He's all over the shop. Whereas if you're going to blame anyone, Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham on Fox News are much more consistent in the lines that these guys use. But I'm not even blaming them because, let's face it, Donald Trump, Fox News host, they're not very cool. If you're a 22-year-old disaffected rebel, you don't care what some 70-year-old politician has to say. You care about what your mates have to say on 8chan, on the internet, when they're little communities where they hang around. They're trying to impress each other.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's much more an influence than Donald Trump or Tucker Carlson, the internet.
I think it's fair to say that you can't blame Donald Trump, but you can certainly say that Donald Trump didn't help.
Definitely didn't help.
Whether it's this particular young man's behaviour or the increase in white nationalist hate crimes, which the FBI says is our biggest problem, much bigger than immigrant violence, much bigger than Islamic extremist violence in the United States. It is white nationalist violence, domestic terrorism that's the problem. The other thing that concerns me about this, Chaz, is Donald Trump tends to, because of the nature of his personality as we understand it from seeing him in this role as a politician and president for the last 3 or 4 years, he tends to view everything through the prism of himself. It's all about him. There was that very strange moment. We didn't get to it in the show. We didn't have time. It wasn't that important. But when he is talking to survivors and first responders and hospital staff in El Paso, after doing the Consoler-in-Chief routine, expressing his best wishes, his appreciation, which was all very presidential, that was all fine. But then very quickly he starts talking to these people about the size of his crowd at the rally he had in El Paso, Texas, and how it was so much bigger than the crowd that Beto O'Rourke had when he had his rival rally on the same day. A few things to say about that. One, not true. Demonstrably, Beto's crowd was bigger, but it's not about crowd size. Ultimately, this is about Donald Trump's ego asserting itself, that all of this became about him, and he quite welcomes, I think, people like Beto O'Rourke crossing lines, talking about Nazis and all this kind of thing, and blaming Trump. This is kind of what he wants, and that is what concerns me about this whole thing.
This certainly does feed into the culture war, which is not helpful in any way, shape or form. It just pushes people further apart, makes them more extreme. But the thing which we shouldn't forget is that the white nationalist thing is a problem.
Yeah.
But these are 3 or 4 shootings out of many. America has a massive guns problem and shootings problem, and this is only a small part of it.
There's much more for us to discuss, and we will do so on our Facebook Extra, also for YouTube and various other platforms. You'll find it on those addresses there. But for now, goodbye.